Altman says potentially as early as 2025, next year. Elon Musk says 2026. Theo from Anthropic Claude says 2026. Ray Kerr as well says human level capabilities by 2029. Jeffrey Hinton is that he means 2029, but Denise Hassabis, who says maybe 10 years. So he's the outlier. So 10 years is 2034. These are the guys who are doing it, and they're saying anywhere between next year and 2034.
Hi guys, and welcome back to the Project Flux podcast. Today you have me and James, who are going to be discussing the latest advances within AI this week and the past week. There's a few amazing stories really to look at, and one of them focuses around BMW's Figure 2 robot deployment. Seeing robots in action in real time really showcases the quickness in which we are developing AI technologies. We're also going to be talking a bit more about AI personalities within Anthropic's Claude's character, and also delving into other stories such as how AI and generative AI specifically can support or shift the way that we approach science. Before we get into it, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Construct AI. They've just been shortlisted for the TechFest 2024 awards by the New Civil Engineer for the best team, I believe it was. And we just had the award ceremony with them recently. So definitely check out Construct AI, our sponsors as well. So no further ado, we'll step into the stories today. So hey James, how are you?
I've been better. The reason Yoshi's doing the intro is because I've lost my voice slightly, so I'm going to try and minimise how much I talk. And apologies to listeners if I sound a bit like Darth Vader today.
Yeah, you do sound a bit like Darth Vader mixed with an AI itself, James.
Yeah, I know. I was toying with the idea of getting an AI to do this, but not enough time, and I don't feel well enough to try and sort that out. But all I can say is I probably sound worse than I feel. So we'll crack on.
Yeah, excellent. So James, the first story we'll look at today actually focuses back on the robot revolution, and it more so focuses on BMW's Figure 2 robot. We mentioned a few months back actually that I believe it was BMW that there were robots out on the production line in Spartanburg, California. This time round, we're now on start seeing these humanoid workers a lot more prevalent within some of these automotive companies. So a bit more about the story. Can you build into that without stressing your voice too much?
I'll do my best. So it's actually, they released a video, BMW did a press release, and they released a video of these Figure 2 robots actually in their plant. And we'll put the link to that in the show notes and everything. It's one thing reading about these things. I think it's the thing when you actually see it, and it's hard to do it justice. So I would just advise everyone to check out the video. But you see these humanoid robots walking around the factory, very human-like, and they're doing, the parts of the process that they're able to lift huge amounts of weight. And what I thought was fascinating is just the flexibility and the precision that they have. They're not quite there, but they're starting to move like humans, that agility that they have. And you've got to remember what these things are designed for. They're designed exactly for the processes. And it's no surprise to me that we're starting in the kind of car manufacturing industry because it is extremely repetitive. But it's only a matter of time now before we see these humanoid robots start coming out into construction sites. So this is a glimpse into the project delivery's future for me, and why it's so important to have a look at what it's doing there. Did you get a chance to see the video yourself, Yoshi?
Yeah, I did see the video, and it is majorly impressive. And just to pick up on your point about these robots being deployed in repetitive environments. So because, they work according to these set parameters, but with the implementation of multiple different AI capabilities, such as computer vision, a subset of that in object detection, and then coupling that now with reinforcement learning with human feedback. They're testing the waters to then put these robots in more unfamiliar, novel places to see how they adjust. And I think, you can actually utilize NVIDIA's technology. I've forgotten the name of it, but you could simulate these robots in actual environments. And the fidelity of those videos really showcase and align to what these things or how these things actually perform in real life. So the technology is increasing rapidly. I know we always say that, but just going through some of the stats across what BMW mentioned in their release, it can lift up to 400 pounds, right? Which is extremely heavy, way heavier than I am. And again, James, you touched on the human-like imitation, especially.
That's the big bit for me. Just like it was.
Yeah, and we actually mentioned about dexterity and the degrees of freedom within extremities and these different things. So that precision, in pick and place tasks can evolve considerably, I'd imagine. And then the key thing as well is the absence of fatigue. I think that's going to be the key differentiator, is the fact that productivity.
They can keep going, can't they? They can just keep going. When as humans, we have this vulnerability, something called sleep that we need. These robots don't need them.
And
they need to be charged. They still presumably have the same battery issues that the electric vehicles have and stuff, so they need to be charged. But that's a much quicker process than what we have to do as humans in terms of R&R and sleep and.
Yeah, and you can charge it to 100%, right? It's not like when you've got your Whoop device and you're sleeping and then you only sleep 80% recovery.
Yeah. For people who don't know what Yoshi's talking about, I wear, because I'm so geeky and into all this data and AI stuff, I wear this thing called a Whoop band that actually measures my sleep. So I'm constantly being told off by it. I'm not getting enough sleep. Not a problem with the Figure 2 robot or the Optimus robot. But as Yoshi said, just get up to 100% after a couple of hours charge and straight. And I think they actually walk their way to the nearest charging point. That's the other thing. It's not like that you have to remember to charge them. They realise when they're out of charge, when they get to a certain percentage, and they take themselves to the nearest charging point and charge up. So that's incredible.
So it creates like an automated ecosystem. And a thing that I really like, and I know I always say this, but when you try to trace or understand the development or trajectory of AI development, you can always liken it to humans. And a big hallmark of human development or evolution was our ability to use tools. So right now we have these robots deployed out on sites who can do high precision pick and place tasks, but there'll be a point where they can also leverage other tools. And if those other tools are then also powered by AI, you'll have an AI powered robot using tools which is also powered with AI. So it creates an ecosystem which, whilst improving the capability, also increases the complexity of these tools. So understanding that within different industries is definitely key. James, in the newsletter, we looked at different industries. I know you mentioned construction sites, and again, that will focus on lifting heavy materials, precise measurements, even forward into site inspections. And then we can step into energy and infrastructure. So then you come into more high risk areas like oil rigs, routine equipment checks, and then operating in extreme temperatures. That's the other thing to mention. Can these things operate in extreme temperatures? What's the implications on the hardware? And I know
extreme temperatures and dangerous areas that humans would otherwise not be able to go to, or not be able to go to without a huge amount of planning. And let's not forget, right, that we're talking about humanoid robots, but you've also got the flying robots, which are drones, and then you've got the moving robots, which is like the Tesla cars coming out. All these things are effectively robots, and this one just happens to be the humanoid robots. But you've got to look at it as a well, as you say, an ecosystem of robotic workers. Some of which will be transporting, some of which will be monitoring, some of which will be doing some of the heavy lifting within factories and within construction sites.
Awesome. And just before we move on to the next story, then James, people listening in and reading through this story, what are some of the things they should be doing right now to consider potentially seeing robots on site in the future?
Well, the first thing to do is honestly look at the video, because we're not going to do it justice. If you do get a chance, just go to the YouTube video and then start thinking about whatever field you're in. What are some of the kind of repetitive, dangerous tasks that you might be doing that you could hand off to these robots eventually? Because I don't think it's too far away. I think we're talking a time scale of, maybe 3, 4, 5 years. And think about how the humanoid robots, it's not going to, we keep saying this, it's not about taking over. It's going to complement your team. Think about it as another member of your team. It's an AI-powered robot. And just learn. I mean, again, we say you're probably preaching to the choir. The people listening are people who are already interested in learning about what's happening out there. But let people know about it as well, so you can stay informed. I think that's the best advice. Just the more you know, the more you'll be able to spot patterns, and you'll be able to spot opportunities for your company or for yourself as these robots become prevalent and I don't think it's going to be too long before, it's going to be quite common to own one of these robots. We talked about it in a previous podcast where we talked about how low the entry price is even now, and it's still at really MVP stage with a lot of these robots. So it'll be, I can very much see it like being another purchase that most people make alongside their car, and then eventually as one of those finance things that you just do because you'll need one.
Yeah, and this is something that's really important as robots become commonplace, but understanding how to communicate with these robots, especially as they improve in their capabilities, but also in things which have meaning, right? So personalities. And that takes me on to our next story.
Yeah.
And this is a story which I find really interesting considering my background. And it talks about AI personality with a focus on what Anthropic have done to Claude's character. So Anthropic had a feature on Lex Fridman's podcast recently, and 𝗵𝗲𝗥𝗪𝗃𝗧, philosopher and also a key member of the team who's working on Claude's character, was on there, and she was speaking much about personalities within AI and how much research, exploration, and diving into philosophy across and other domains, and how those things are really important in setting a character and why it's so important for these AIs. And she goes on to talk about how AI personality can be mapped across different development stages. And as that AI progresses through the development pipeline, all the way from pre-training, post-training, deployment, fine-tuning, system prompting, the personality itself becomes a lot more fixed. It's a bit like teaching an old dog tricks, right? It's easy to do at the start, and as it becomes a lot older, a lot of that becomes hardwired, and there isn't much customization. But what I really liked about Anthropic's approach to personality is they try out so many different things. And relating back to the Golden Gate Bridge, we touched on it a few weeks ago. That was one personality where they tested for 24 hours, how much can we make the AI showcase a personality? And funnily enough, even though that was more of a gimmick, doing some testing in the background, people actually really took to that LLM, that large language model, because it had this obsession that we touched on that tab. So 𝗵𝗲𝗥𝗪𝗃𝗧 actually goes on to mention with Claude, their philosophy was for it not to just be an AI LLM, right? They actually argued that, even though there's a risk of over anthropomorphizing some of these AIs, you can also under anthropomorphize. And when they developed Claude in terms of their philosophy, it wasn't to just mirror users or be strictly neutral. They actually wanted it to emulate how it was to be a human, right? And to give an example of that, it's like she mentioned, when you look at Claude, it has to be able to represent different cultures, right? And these LLMs do struggle with some of these cultural blind spots. And the way that they actually programmed Claude was not to be completely all-knowing about different cultures, but to think of it as a world traveler, someone who has gone around the world and traveled around the world. How would they communicate in that instance? And I like how they emulate what it would be like to be a human. So what are your thoughts on that, James, in terms of not developing or designing these AIs to be completely robotic, but actually adding in some of that human element into it, so it's easier for us to communicate with these robots or AIs?
I think that's Claude's great strength in that it does that. But it does remind me of a quote quite a while back from, I think it was Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, when he was asked the question, are we overestimating the power of these large language models, AI generally? And he said, no, we are underestimating it, because we keep thinking that, okay, well, it's just programmed and therefore it only does the things that we tell it to do, which is true. But I think you raised the point that, that's what humans do as well. We're just we're the subject. Yes, we got our nurture, but a lot of how we act is because of our training. Yeah, intentional, unintentional training. So it's no different. And I think if we want adoption to be widespread, and let's not kid ourselves here, the adoption of some of these tools, even though it's really taken off, is still quite low. There was a survey recently saying that, only a very small percentage of people in the construction industry, we're talking less than double digits, use AI tools regularly. So yeah, we're very aware of what it does because we're in the space and we use it. But it's still very, very early days. And the adoption problem will be solved by having a tool that does feel human to use, because at the moment we very much have a separation between us, as in the human race, and tools. And we always think of tools as very good at a very narrow subject, whatever it may be, but it needs full human control. And most people haven't got their head around what we know is going to be happening with these agentic workflows, etc., that these new breed of tools are going to be more than just tools. They are going to be agents. By making it as human as possible, which is what Claude is doing, it's going to make it a lot easier for adoption. Put it this way, if I was to recommend a large language model for my mum and dad to use, I would put them in the direction of Claude rather than ChatGPT or any of the others, because I feel that they would get it more and they would feel more comfortable working with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that is a testament to the way that Anthropic have designed the character for Claude, and being more specific into that. Some of the things they actually looked to instill was for Claude to be honest about learned perspectives. So what that basically means is, another example here is when you have people who believe in a flat earth theory, for instance, there are so many people who believe in this and they have their justifications and their reasonings for it. Now, take Claude in this example. It was trained to not outright reject a lot of these viewpoints, but to actually understand and provide considerations to the user about why they believe that. So it's more of not a straight up rejection, but it's being more charitable with the responses that you give back and focusing, drilling into that learned perspective with the user across that dialogue. And I like that. And to do that, they've also implemented innate curiosity, which humans, that's our biggest strength within Claude. But then equally, it was to maintain some ethical boundaries. So in and amongst all that, it always needs to follow ethical boundaries. And this is why when they developed the Claude's character, it was done during the alignment towards, or in alignment to the alignment phase of Anthropic's development. And it was done early on. And this is where they can set this, trial it, red team, test it, develop it, deploy it. And this would allow them to actually understand a bit more about the way the character would display itself. And also, Dario mentioned this before, the CEO of Anthropic, is that the character itself is also heavily aligned to constitutional AI. And that effectively refers to principles, because you can't always have humans, overseeing every single thing that an LLM does, but you can set these hard principles for the AI to then, using its own chain of thought, look at what it said, revise that, and then pick out the best option for it to provide. And again, that echoes through the training process. It just gives you more information about how this actually happens in development. What Anthropic would do is they would have Claude itself synthetically generate messages based on some of these high-level desired traits that they wanted to have, like I mentioned. What they would then do, it was they would expose the model to some of these desired traits. It would then provide multiple different responses to what the developer or designer or the user has put through, and it would self-rank itself in alignment to that targeted trait. And that's how it starts to learn its personality. Now, the interesting thing, James, and I'd like to get your thought on this, is in that process, it is all based on synthetic data.
Yeah.
Claude itself generates the data. So, it has a level of thinking, it generates that sort of data. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's only so much. So it's either going to go one or two ways, right? Either we're going to run out of data and then we won't have any more advances, or the synthetic data is going to come into play. And I think it's obvious that synthetic data, there's no reason at all why we can't use synthetic data to help sort of power the additional learning that's going to happen. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. So you take it back to project delivery, right? The argument I often hear from people, which is, we just don't have good enough data. But we've got enough knowledge in experience, what have you, to be able to create synthetic. We don't need all of that data literally from actual projects or from wherever it may be. We can generate synthetic data, but I think people, unfortunately, they correlate synthetic with bad. And I think if it's synthetic, it must be bad. But I would argue that you can have some real data that has not been labeled and not been cleaned properly, which is worse. I'd rather have synthetic data that has been generated using the right kind of criteria and the right prompts than a load of supposedly, I'm using exclamation marks here, people can't see me on the podcast, supposedly good real data that actually is just garbage.
Yes, because that opens up a dilemma, right? Because then that tells you what not to do. And then ChatGPT or some of these other large language models or AIs will then prescribe to you and stipulate what you should do to avoid that mistake. It doesn't mean that that's also going to be the right course of action.
And you're just adding bias into these models. We know that these models, I mean, you could say that the internet is full of data, right? Or let's say Reddit, okay? Let's say Reddit, it's full of data, but nobody in their right mind would say that's all good quality data.
Yeah, exactly. But that's one of the biggest concerns about scaling these AI is that we will effectively run out of data at some point. So having synthetic data is going to be key. Just to kind of move on from this story then, just before
we move on from the story, I just want to add that, there was another story that goes hand in hand with what we talk about with Claude, which is Amazon, who are the biggest sponsor of Anthropic, who developed Claude, have just announced they're investing another $4 billion in it.
Yeah.
4 billion. So it's mind-boggling amounts of money going into these systems.
Yeah, and I think that definitely lends to Anthropic being so transparent with their developments. I think that's what's helped a lot in the investment come in.
Here's something I do. I don't know if you do this, right? We talked about toolbox, the AI tools. I've taken to, because I think ChatGPT is really good at sort of getting, first, it's really good at that kind of workforce stuff, like just saying, you've got a first draft or something, or, you've done that conversation with it. But I've taken to getting a response from ChatGPT, kind of pasting it into Claude and saying, Claude, do what you do best and turn this into something better. Have you done anything similar to that?
I've not tried that, but following the podcast, I think that's where Claude's strengths actually lie.
Yeah, I do that a lot. It's a nice little hack for anyone listening. Try the two side by side. Use them for their strengths.
Yeah, and again, different LLMs, have different strengths and weaknesses. So I think that's definitely one thing to look out for. But before we move on to the next story then, with AI personality, I use that word loosely because as much as we can say AI has a personality, it's not to the same extent as a human. There are limitations. For instance, there is no emotional capacity. LLMs still do rely on learned patterns, not genuine emotions. And you can see that in the sense that it struggles with things like sarcasm. There are cultural blind spots that it has. And to note, our personalities are mutable. They're dynamic. They change over time. These personalities aren't. They're fixed during the initial training and don't evolve with user interactions. However, we would argue that large language models do personalize their responses to you depending on what's on your system prompt in the custom instructions, but also as it has memory to learn how you communicate with it. So there will be an adjustment, but it isn't so much to be a trait change to its personality.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
Next story, James, that we'd like to touch on, and I know you've mentioned this about how a lot of these AI capabilities grow and become a lot more powerful. We need to be aware of the things that they can do. Evolve from being more repetitive tasks or narrow tasks as well to strong AI, right? More generalized tasks. And one thing we touched on in the newsletter was the countdown to AGI. So everyone wants to know when AGI is going to be, and there is starting to be more of a narrowed consensus among some of the big tech players, titans in the game, but there are always different opinions on this. So James, can you give us a breakdown of that story then?
So let's just break down AGI for the listeners again. We're talking about artificial general intelligence, and we're talking about the point that artificial intelligence effectively becomes smarter than humans, but not across one field, but across multiple fields. So imagine somebody who has spent their whole life becoming a physics guru, professor, but then they can do that same level across all fields. That's effectively one sort of definition of AGI. There's quite a lot of, we've covered it a few times, but what we've done this time is we've sort of taken within the newsletter, the key players, and we've done some research as to when are they saying it's going to be. Because there are a few people saying, look, it's no time soon. But what does that mean? And I think people are getting confused with timescales here, because when some of these people say no time soon, they're talking about 2 or 3 years, whereas some people are interpreting that to mean 2030 or not in my lifetime. So we broke it down and we looked at the key people. So Sam Altman from OpenAI, ChatGPT, Elon Musk, Dario from Claude, Ray Kurzweil, who is the person that did the Singularity is Near, Geoffrey Hinton, who is the person that just got he just got the Nobel Prize, didn't he, for breakthroughs in AI, and 𝗬𝗲𝗄𝗏 𝗏𝗏𝗏, who's also one of the he's one of the investors in N-Plan when we had Dev on a few weeks ago. Right, so just get this. So just if people were thinking that this isn't any time soon, This is what these guys think it's going to be. Right? 𝗬𝗵𝗲𝗏 says potentially as early as 2025, next year. Elon Musk says 2026. Theo from Anthropic Claude says 2026. Ray Kurzweil says human level capabilities by 2029. Geoffrey Hinton, and he's the one who said, "Oh, it's not anytime soon." When he says that, he means 2029. But Denise Hassabis, who says maybe 10 years. So he's the outlier. So 10 years is 2034. So these incredibly clever people, and you may say they're all invested in it, and that's true to some extent as well. But there is a trend here. You've got to look at the data. These are the guys who are doing it, and they're saying anywhere between next year and 2034. So in the 10 years, effectively, what that comes down to. And the median, I haven't actually done this, but I would imagine the median's around sort of 2027, 2028, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And I guess one of the added complexities is going back to the age-old definition of AGI. So we say that it's, like you mentioned, James, when it can do things better than what a human can. And to put that in context as well, Dario would argue at the point where the AI is smarter than a Nobel Prize winner. So that level of specificity. I think it's also worth considering when they say, I think it's more than just the intelligence component for me, because in order for it to be generalized, it has to be able to go beyond transfer learning, right? Which is the ability for an AI to exceed in one task because it was loosely related to another. I think the ability for it to exceed human capability in completely distinct tasks that it hasn't been trained on is that abductive reasoning. I think it needs to be able to have that ability, as well as also have domain expertise. It has to be able to go deep into subjects. And that's kind of counterintuitive with the word general in that sense, I would say, because general becomes more breadth. It can cover more things. I think it needs breadth, but it also needs to have the depth. And that's what I would say that's how I would define AGI at that point. Yeah. So I think I would also say within a few years, I think it's the matter of time. Time will tell whether or not this transformer approach works, if LLMs are actually delivering how we intended them to design. Is designing it based upon neural networks and deep learning the actual way forward?
I don't think it will be a linear line to it. I don't think we can just say we're going to keep scaling at the rate that we're scaling. It will probably reach a plateau at some point, and it might be already. There's rumours, for instance, that GPT-5 is hit some snags from OpenAI because it's not producing the results that they thought it would. But I think that's fine because they'll come up with some other technology to power it. So it won't be a straight line. What I can see is a number of plateaus being reached, and then some big leaps when that problem is overcome. The reason why I think it will definitely be overcome is just because of the amount of money that's being invested in it. It's just so mind-bogglingly huge, and there's so many people invested in making sure this happens that it will happen. Now, I think for people listening, you've got to get your head around. It's a hard concept to ask people to get their head around. But, within a few years, we will not be the most intelligent species on the planet.
It will be what Mustafa Solomon called this new digital species, right?
Yeah, there'll be, and that's quite a hard thing, and the kind of response I usually get from people when I say that is mockery. I've heard it all before, or not in my lifetime, something. So it's quite a hard sell because no one wants to hear that because it's quite deflating to the human ego in a lot of ways. But you've got to look at the opportunities as well. It's got the potential to solve, not just in project delivery of all types, but just a much bigger scale to solve many of the world's challenges. And I look at it optimistically that we live in this incredible time that we've got the opportunity to live through that. Imagine being around when the electricity was invented or when the wheel was invented, watching how that transformed society. So that's effectively what we're going to be able to do. We're going to be living through a period of time when, for the first time in, I don't know, the whole of the universe, we're going to be usurped as the most intelligent species. So I see that as a positive. Because let's face it, we're the most intelligent species. We haven't done a brilliant job of things.
It reminds me of the Seinfeld video that you shared with me.
Well, yeah. Do you want to? I should add that to the show notes. I wonder if I could get that. If I thought about that, I would have got that up for viewers to hear, but effectively he just says that exactly that. We haven't done a particularly good job of being custodians of the planet today. So yeah, maybe this isn't such a bad thing.
They might do a better job than us. Exactly. So, and just touching on keeping with the idea that we are inventing AI, and one of the big use cases, well, the main thing is for it to accelerate our understanding of the world around us so we can progress scientifically in terms of improving our health, our well-being in the future, and all these different elements that fall into that. And the way that we currently do that is through scientific research. And the last story that I want to talk about today, James, is actually how researchers have actually been able to use AI to optimize the way that we conduct research. It's looked at it within a neuroscience lens, but this can be extrapolated to other domains, any domain really. But this was a study which was published in Nature Journal recently, and effectively the researchers did two things. They created a benchmark called BrainBench, and this comprised 200 neuroscience abstracts in two versions, an original version and an alternate version. Now, for those that don't know what abstract is, it's effectively a short summary of a study. So it includes the reasoning as to why the research was done, the experimental design, the analysis, the results, and then the conclusion, and then some open room for further interpretation or further research. So they took these abstracts and they gave it to, this was the BrainBench benchmark, they gave these abstracts to humans and they gave it to off-the-shelf LLMs. And they also then created their own large language model, from what I could understand, called BrainGPT. Test performance, where the humans of these different groups had to match the outcome with the study itself. Okay, so the experimental design. And obviously they would doctor a few of them and they had the original or the altered versions. What they found was the LLMs had an 81.4% accuracy and the human experts had a 63.4% accuracy. BrainGPT, the custom GPT that they fine-tuned on neuroscience literature, actually, no surprise, performed the best. James, does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it would have, but it doesn't surprise me. Mainly because, like I keep saying, human beings have, and if you look at anyone in any kind of project delivery, we massively overestimate ourselves. We have these biases, always over promising. We are always we're always over optimistic with our time periods that it takes to do things. So that doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, if anything, I'm probably, given what I've read, surprised it's not slightly more.
Yeah, exactly. And just on that then, what they also did was manage to understand, using some simple formulas, to get a confidence rating from the LLM itself. And when it was more confident, its predictions were often more correct. So there was a lot more to look into. But some of the key learnings that we took away from this is we can now use AI to accelerate discovery. Its core strength is the ability to analyze large data sets way faster than humans. Scholarly articles are quite comprehensive, they're wordy, they are complex, and using AI to uncover these patterns is extremely useful. But I think the key point as well is we as humans we're curious, we think of things, we innovate new ideas. What we can use LLMs for is to actually help us then generate hypotheses across each of these ideas that we have. Going even further, you can use an AI across every single stage of your research, right? So you have your initial concept, your idea that you're looking into. You then have your hypothesis itself, which you can use the AI to help generate. You can then also, following the hypothesis, use it to help you generate your experimental design. Your sample sizes, your demographics, what sort of measurements you're going to be doing. Is it longitudinal studies? Is it going to be a meta-analysis? All these different things, you can then use the AI to help support or accelerate your research. In and amongst that, you can then also use the AI to predict high impact experiments. And the power of that is it allows you to then allocate resources a lot more effectively. So when you're working on hypothesis to achieve a grant, for instance, within a specific area, what are some of the areas which are high impact, where you can optimize these resources so you're actually going to be likely to get much better outcomes? And then in amongst that, you can then use the AI in terms of its strengths of analyzing data and complement it with human creativity, which is what we mentioned. You can't be too reliant on the AI because you're going to lose that innovation. Remember, it is just trained off.
It's the marriage of the two.
It's a marriage of the two. So you don't want to have that over reliance because the exploration remains integral to that process. So this is what the research had done. and what it showcases how we can shift our approaches to science in that sense.
Yeah, it's just another example of how it's sort of augmenting, that's the right word, augmenting other areas of life, in this case research. But
Yeah, exactly.
I find it harder and harder to start distinguishing, because, we started this podcast really to focus on AI and project delivery, but it's really hard to separate things out because it's all interconnected. And we end up spending a lot of time talking about the foundational models and stories like this, but it's important because you can't separate it off. You can't say, well, this story isn't distinctly about project delivery, therefore it's not relevant, because it is. It's all relevant, because project delivery, as whatever that may be, whether it's in construction or whether that's in law or whether it's all based on what's happening with these foundational models, and also these kind of things that we're starting to change how we're doing research.
Exactly. I just, on that bit there, I mentioned, you can do it across every stage of your research. We looked back a few weeks ago where with these AI personalities, you can actually emulate certain demographics. So if you're doing, like myself, when I did my cognitive neuroscience research, I had to get participants in. Now, if I had the experimental design done by the AI itself, I can actually then emulate participants actually taking my experiment itself and then analyzing the results from the AI. So effectively, one day it can become fully automated, especially as you add in synthetic data and all these different elements. Yeah, potentially a huge paradigm shift within science. It will make it a lot more resourceful, and it could allow us to simulate a lot more experiments to actually understand what are some of these high impact areas where we could be focusing our time much more effectively, balancing that partnership with AI and human ingenuity. So James, those are our 4 big studies this week, each touching on a different pillar of AI and big focal points at the moment. What was your most interesting of them all?
I mean, it's like I say, they're all interconnected, I think. So they're all interesting. But I guess just actually doing a study on the AGI rather than hearsay was really interesting for me. I'm finding out that it's these guys are saying it sooner than we think. It's probably the most interesting, because that's going to dictate where these stories go in 2025, 2026, and 2027. And that's a good time to do a little shout out, really, 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗏, to everyone. So we're coming towards the end of the year, and we want to know from you, the listeners, what you want from Project Flux and the podcast and the newsletter. So if you're interested, just give us a shout. We're really, really interested to talk to people, to find out what your views are, how we can improve, how we can give you the stories that you want. So over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be reaching out to some of our listeners. And if you're interested in giving your view, just get in touch. If you go to the podcast, there's a text me button, so you can do that, or you can just get in touch with us through the newsletter. There's an email address there. Or through the Project Data Analytics Task Force website. It's info@pdataskforce.com, and we'll arrange a quick catch up with you to find out where you want us to take this, because at the end of the day, as we always say, we do this for you, and we've got to make sure we're serving you. So yeah, all interesting, mate, but that one was quite interesting, just to actually do a bit of a study around it.
Awesome. And that is a great conclusion to this episode, James. So thank you for joining us whilst you've had a bit of a flu. You do sound a bit like Darth Vader, but not too bad.
It's quite a cool thing, mate. I apologise to everyone to listen to me speak like this. Hopefully I'll be better by next week.
Awesome. And like I mentioned, guys, we'll be back next week with another podcast episode, hoping to cover even more AI breakthroughs then. But until then, we will see you soon.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. 𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗏 and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want, so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.